So here are our notes on our second unit, which is genetics. So genetics, the thing that we're about to start studying, is when we look at inherited traits. And inherited means comes from the parent to their children or their offspring. And we're going to look at a couple things, like what is a trait, what are the different versions of a trait called, how do we use these things called Punnett squares to predict traits that we'll see in the offspring, and what we can do with those predictions. So one of the first things that we have to remember is that all living things have DNA. So the DNA is the code for the traits. So then all living things have traits. Some of those traits are the same throughout all of life. Some of those traits are different and have different versions. So looking at the history behind genetics and where did this come from? Well, of course, obviously it comes from the DNA. But who discovered it? That was an Austrian monk. His name was Gregor Mendel. In that first video that I had you watch, it was kind of just a silly little comparison of who he is, or a parody, I guess would have been the better word. But he actually studied thousands of plants. Thankfully, he picked pea plants. Here's the great thing about pea plants. Pea plants, they like to self-fertilize. So it was pretty easy to get them to mate. The second thing is all of their traits are an either-or situation. They're either purple or white. Their seeds are round or wrinkled. They're either tall or short. There's no in-betweens. Now, Gregor Mendel didn't really understand the magnitude of his decision when he chose pea plants. He just thought, well, they're easy to grow and they're easy to either force to pollinate each other or to self-pollinate or to keep them from self-pollinating. So that's why he chose them. But it ended up being an awesome discovery. Had he chose a different plant, we may not know the things that we know now about genetics. And as a matter of fact, a lot of his work was kind of brushed off to the side for a couple years until somebody else rediscovered it. So how Gregor Mendel did his work when he was growing thousands of peas and spending all of his time with those pea plants was he would take the plant, and when it flowered, he would remove the male parts from the first plant that he was looking at. And then he would take the pollen from the second plant that he wanted to study, and he would transfer that to the female parts of the first plant. So just in case you're not aware, let's just quickly discuss this. Most flowers have both male and female parts in the same flower. There are flowers where this isn't the case, that there are male flowers and also female flowers, like in pumpkins. But for the most part, many flowers, and they're called perfect flowers, have both male and female parts on them at the same time. So you would literally cut the male anthers off of the first flower, and an anther looks something like this. And then he would take the pollen that was all dotted all over this, and he would transfer it to the female part of the second plant. And this is the stigma with the ovaries inside of there. Then he would, after that plant would form seeds down in here, he would plant those seeds and see the result. So like I already said, Mendel chose a great plant to study with the pea. Peas are simple, one trait or the other, or one version of the trait or the other. So now Mendel is called the father of genetics. He was the one who actually gave us or showed us what these laws of inheritance of traits would be. And we're going to learn about all of those laws or those rules or how things are inherited. So let's talk about some basic terminology. And I know I have you doing vocabulary words, but sometimes we need just a little bit more of an explanation. So when I say a trait, I can use the word characteristic synonymously. So that just means that we're looking at something about the organism. So we're looking at height, or we're looking at fur color, or, well, not in plants. You wouldn't be looking at fur color. In plants, you'd be looking at flower color. Or you're looking at the shape of the seed, or the color of the seed, or how many hairs the plant has on it, or how many inches or centimeters between each set of leaves. Okay, so there's all kinds of different traits or characteristics that we can look at. Each of those traits or characteristics has different versions that would call a really fancy term alleles. Okay, so let's look at a human example, because sometimes it helps us to think in human terms. So in human terms, hair color would be the trait, and the different alleles for hair color would be red, brown, black, blonde, okay, and there's a lot of variance in between that too. But it's just the variant or the version of it. So some examples in plants, especially the pea plants that Gregor Mendel studied, flower color was either purple or it was white. Okay, we had round seeds or wrinkled seeds. Take a look at peas the next time you eat them and see how many are actually round versus wrinkled. And then we had plant height. Again, height is a broad category, and short and tall or dwarf. They like to call plants dwarf instead of short. It's not a derogatory term, it's just what it is. Okay, so it would be like a really big pain in the butt to constantly write out purple, white, tall or short, thin or thick, round or wrinkled. So scientists, because we tend to be lazy, have a shorthand for writing down the different versions of the trait, those alleles. And it's not just because we're lazy, it's because it would be a mess to see if we had to write the full words for all of these alleles all the time. Okay, so we're going to have a shorthand for it, which is usually the first letter of what we're going to call the dominant allele. Now, Mendel, in his work, he determined through all of those thousands of plants that he studied that some versions or alleles were stronger or appeared to be stronger, and therefore he saw those more when he crossed plants. And he called those alleles dominant. Okay. So in our pea example, purple flowers are dominant over white flowers. He saw the purple flowers more. So our shorthand is going to be just a capital P for purple. Mendel also showed that some alleles are weaker and tended to appear less often. He called those recessive or lesser alleles. In our pea example, we had the purple was dominant to white flower color, so white would be the recessive. And instead of using a W, we're going to use a little p, so that when we say big P is purple, and little p, and I put a line over it so you know that one's little, is white. That way we always remember which one is dominant and which one is recessive. Okay. We can look at green peas are recessive to yellow. So the yellow is the dominant allele, would be capital Y, and the green, which is the recessive allele, would be little y. Okay. So the thing with recessive alleles, like the green pea, is they can only appear when there are no yellow or dominant alleles present, because the dominant ones cover up the recessive ones. So the only way that we're going to ever see green peas, and we see a lot of them, and we'll talk about why that happens later. But the only way that we would see this is if we had the mom giving a little Y for the green P allele and the dad also giving a little Y for the green P allele. Or if we use our flower example, mom would give a little P for white and dad would give a little P for white. If dad were to give a big P and mom were to give a little P, we would see a purple plant. So here are some examples of the trait, the allele, and what we would represent it, whether it's dominant or recessive in plants. So let's take a look at one that we haven't looked at so far. So plant height, that is the trait. Height is a broad category. There are two different alleles for plant height, tall and dwarf or short. The tall is going to be dominant, and we're going to represent that with the uppercase T. And then dwarf is going to be recessive, and that's going to get the little t. And remember, the shorthand is just to help us so we don't have to keep writing tall or dwarf again and again. Okay, so as I was going over before when I said one from mom, one from dad, every organism has two alleles or versions for every trait. Sometimes those alleles are exactly the same. Sometimes they're different. Okay, and they always get one from the female parent and one from the male parent. Now, we're not talking about asexual reproduction yet, where we're just making an exact copy. So this is in sexual reproduction. We have a female parent and we have a male parent. Okay. This set of alleles or letters that an organism has is called its genotype. Because we don't want to write out the words, we're going to use our shorthand, remember. So if we say a flower has two purple alleles, we don't want to write purple, purple. We want to write big P because it's shorter and easier. Okay, and again, this is its genotype. It is very, very, very super important that you do everything you can to remember the difference between traits and alleles, dominant, recessive, genotype, and another word we're going to come to now, which is phenotype. I want you guys to practice with these a lot because it's going to make all of our problem sets a lot easier if you can do that. Okay, so we just looked at the genotype of an organism, which was its set of alleles. Well, what does that really tell us? That tells us, by its set of alleles, what the phenotype or physical look of the organism will be. I remember that because physical starts with pH and so does phenotype. So we want to know, okay, so what? If the flower is big P or purple, purple, what color will it be? Well, it will be purple. Well, what about if the flower is little p? Okay, because it has two recessive alleles, it will be white. What happens in the case where we have one dominant allele and one recessive allele? Well, in that case, because there still is a big P, it's going to cover up that little p and it's going to be purple. Remember to pause this at any time if you need some more practice or just need to go back through these notes or go back through the vocabulary and ask lots of questions. Okay, so a few more terms that we need to go over. The genotype of an organism is determined at fertilization, when the egg and sperm combine. In plants, that's known as pollen. Okay. When the egg is fertilized, it's called a zygote. A zygote can have two of the same alleles, which would be either both dominant or both recessive, or it can have one dominant and one recessive. Okay, so we can be big P, little p, or big P, little p. Okay. When we say that the alleles in the zygote are the same, then we call that homozygous. Homo meaning the same, zygote is that fertilized egg. After the egg and pollen have combined. When we say that those alleles are different, one big letter and one small, one dominant, one recessive, we call that heterozygous. Hetero meaning different, and again, zygote is the fertilized egg. Okay, so if you're following along, there are 3 different genotypes that can occur so far, and each has a name. If we have 2 dominant alleles, which would be 2 capital letters, we're going to call that homozygous, 2 of the same, dominant. Pretty easy, just combining our 2 vocab terms there. If we have 2 recessive alleles, 2 little letters, we're going to call that homozygous recessive. Again, homozygous meaning the same, recessive meaning not dominant or weaker. If we have 1 dominant allele, like big P, and 1 recessive allele, little p, or big R, little r, we're going to call that heterozygous. And that way we know. Now you should be able to just look at homozygous dominant and immediately assign it 2 capital letters, or look at heterozygous and know that it's 1 big letter and 1 little letter. So here are some more examples for us to take a look at. You would probably do really well to write this chart down, maybe practice with it. So we have color, shape, and height are traits. Again, remember those are broad categories. The alleles for color are purple and white. We've been talking about that a lot. Okay, those are the versions of that trait. Purple is dominant, white is recessive. So in the homozygous dominant form, we'd have big P, big P. The homozygous recessive form, we'd have little p, little p. And in the heterozygous, we'd have 1 dominant and 1 recessive, so big P, little p. Now notice we use different letters for different traits. So for shape of the seed, in that case, round happens to be dominant. So we're going to use big R to represent the round allele and little r's to represent the wrinkled allele. And then down here with tall and dwarf in plant height, tall happens to be dominant, so we're going to use big T. The convention is that we use the first letter of the dominant allele. Okay, so the other thing that you need to remember is that sometimes when you're writing, big O and little o can look really similar to each other, or big C and little c. So what usually scientists do is they make some distinguishing mark, like a line, over their lowercase letters. And that just helps people to identify what it is that they're writing. Okay, so the reason why I had you go through all of this is because it's really, really, really important that you are super, uber comfortable with this technology, with this terminology, okay? That's why I had you do the vocabulary. That is something you need to practice, 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 practice. You would not expect to walk into, let's say, French class and never knowing any words in French be able to answer a question in French, okay? So even though I know this is not a foreign language class, that this is science, when we are speaking genetics, it is its own language. If you don't know the difference between homozygous and heterozygous, dominant and recessive, genotype and phenotype, you will not be successful. Just like you wouldn't be successful in a foreign language class. So I beg of you, please practice these terms. Explain them to your neighbor. Explain them to your parents. I don't care if you have to set your stuffed animals out on your bed and explain them to your stuffed animals. Create a YouTube video. Make it funny. Do something that is going to help you to understand these terms. I am a big flashcard person. I love flashcards. Make lots of flashcards. Practice flashcards. Just whatever it is that you can do. Okay? And I know I kind of harped on that for a while, but again, the more you know these terms, the easier this unit will fly by, and it will actually be a lot of fun, and it won't be a struggle. Okay, so just as a wrap up on our last slide, here's some of that terminology and then examples that go along with it. So you might want to take this down and make sure that you look over this. These would be great ways to make flashcards. So for instance, on one side you could put trait, and then on the other side you could put flower color. And you could list any of those other examples that we said too, like plant height or seed type, okay? Anything like that. But here we're going to go through. The trait would be flower color. The versions or alleles are going to be purple or white for a pea plant. The dominant allele is purple or capital P. The recessive allele is white or little p. The homozygous dominant version or genotype is going to be big P, or purple. The homozygous recessive is going to be little p, which would make a phenotype of white. The heterozygous version is big P, little p. Okay. Our genotypes, again, are the letters, the genes. Okay, we get genotype from genes. What genes did it get from mom? What gene did it get from dad? And then the phenotype is physically what it looks like. Please ask if you have questions. I'd be happy to go over any of this with you again. And I can't wait to our next set of notes and some of the practice activities that we get to do. Have a great night. Thanks. Bye.